I'm Jessie of Faraway Road, the creator of Snowflakes freezer paper shapes for English paper piecing and applique. This video is part 1 of how to English paper piece using Snowflakes freezer paper shapes. In this video, I'll talk about the supplies that I use and how to prepare your shapes for English paper piecing. Real quick, English paper piecing is a technique where each piece of fabric in the quilt has its own paper template. The template is the exact size and shape that the finished piece will be in the quilt. The templates are attached to your fabric, and then the fabric is cut out leaving a seam allowance outside the template. The seam allowance is folded over to the back of the template and basted down using large stitches. Once all the pieces are basted, then they're attached together using an invisible hand stitch. After all the pieces are attached, then the basting is removed and the papers are removed, and that leaves only your perfectly pieced fabric shapes. So let me talk about what I have in my sewing kit. I have my Snowflakes freezer paper shapes. These are die cut pieces of freezer paper. Freezer paper is a sturdy paper that has a coating on one side that allows it to temporarily stick to fabric when it's been ironed on. And then after you're done using it, it peels completely off without leaving any residue. I have my rock sand needles. These are number 10 sharps. I use the same size of needle for both my basting and for my piecing, but I keep my basting needles separate from my piecing needles because once the needle has gone through the paper so many times when you're basting, it's going to be dull, and so I don't want to try to piece with that same needle. I'll set aside my basting needle and get a fresh needle for piecing. I wear a thimble on my middle finger. I use it to push the needle through the fabric. I like a metal thimble that has a ridge around the top because it grabs the needle a little bit as you're pushing it through. I keep a pair of little kid scissors in my sewing kit. I like these just because they have a blunt tip and I don't have to worry about them poking a hole in anything in my kit. I have fabric scissors for fabric only, of course. I have a spool of hand quilting thread. The hand quilting thread is what I use for basting. I like to use it because it has kind of a coating on it that makes it stiff and that keeps it from tangling while you're working. I just really love that extra feature. For piecing the shapes together, I use Aurifil 50 weight thread. This is 100% cotton thread that is both fine and strong. I really like using cotton thread just because it tends to disappear into your seams a lot easier than other threads. I keep a couple of grays and white and tan in my kit, and I almost always just pick one of these neutrals and use them for piecing my whole project. If I happen to have a whole project of, say, red hexagons, then I would go ahead and buy a spool of red thread, but for the most part, when you're piecing lots of different colors of fabric together, it's just easier to pick one neutral that kind of goes with everything and stick with that. This light gray is the one that I definitely use the most. I have my iron over here, and I have a pressing surface, and I popped my name tag in here. Since you guys can't see me, you'll know it's me. Alright, so I'm ready to get started. I'm going to place my fabric face down on my pressing surface, iron it real quick to make sure it's nice and flat. Then I want to arrange my freezer paper shapes on the fabric with the shiny side down. The shiny side of the template should be touching the wrong side of your fabric. And I want to leave about 5/8 of an inch in between each one so I have plenty of room for my seam allowance. I'm going to iron these down, and it only takes a second or two for them to adhere. You don't have to hold it down at all. Alright, now they're stuck on. I love how they just stick on there. And I'm ready to cut them out. You can definitely just eyeball a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I tend to be a little bit generous with my seam allowance, so maybe just a little more than a 1/4 inch if I can swing it. Just going to cut the whole way around, leaving my 1/4 inch outside the template shape. Alright, now we're ready to baste this down. Alright, usually I use white thread for my basting just because I don't like to be distracted by a lot of different colors. But for the video I found a dark thread so it would show up against the background a little bit better. Focus this. Okay, the first thing we have to do is make a knot. I've already threaded my needle. I'm going to take the long tail and hold it right up here against the needle. Wrap it around the needle 2 times. If I had a really fine thread, I would wrap that around 3 or 4 times. But for a thick hand quilting thread, 2 wraps is plenty. I'm going to pinch the wraps with my other hand, pinch the wraps with my left hand, and while I'm still holding those tight, I'm going to push the needle through the wraps and pull it the whole way through. I've still got the wraps over here in my left hand, and when you get to the end, then you've got a nice little knot right at the end of your thread where you want it to be. Okay, I usually start basting right in the middle of a side, fold that seam allowance over nice and tight, and I like my knots to be on the back so they're not distracting when I'm looking at my work. So I'll start from the back, push the needle through the paper template and both layers of fabric, so you're sewing right through the paper when you're basting. I'm going to come back up to the back about 3/8 of an inch right here before the corner. Finger press this side as best as I can. Now fold the other side over and finger press that. Now I'm going to take a stitch right into the point of the shape. That holds all of the folds together and keeps the corner nice and tight. Now I'm going to just take one stitch up and back on this side. If the shape was an inch on each side or less, then you wouldn't need this stitch down the middle. But this is a 1.5 inch diamond, so I'm going to go ahead and do that extra stitch to try to keep it really nice and secure. I'm going to come up again right about 3/8 of an inch before the corner. I finger pressed this. Now I'm going to fold the next side over and finger press that and put my needle right into that fold, again to hold everything nice and tight on the corner. Now let me just keep going around here. One stitch down the middle. Finger press this side. Fold the next side down and finger press that. And then take a stitch right into the point where the thickest bulk of the fabric is. That's where you want to take your stitch down. Alright, now I've gotten to the last corner. I'm going to bring my needle to the back one more time, about 3/8 of an inch before the corner. And then I find it helpful to kind of sweep the seam allowance towards the corner and then fold the last seam allowance down using my needle. Gives me a nice tight corner on the last side. Since I like my knots to be on the back, I'm going to come to the back before I make my final knot. And here's how I do this last knot. I make a U shape with the thread. I'm holding the U in my left hand, and I pass the needle under this thread here and through the U just one time. One loop is plenty. Pull it the whole way through. I've still got my loop in my left hand, and I'm just going to kind of wiggle the string from both sides until the point where the threads all cross is right next to the fabric. I'll press the whole thing down with my finger and pull it tight. And now the knot is right down next to the fabric where I want it to be. All right, so now I've got one shape basted and ready to join together. After you get a couple more shapes basted, then you can watch part 2 of my video series where I'll show you how to join the pieces together using a ladder stitch. The ladder stitch is the stitch that I like to use because I find it really easy to get a nice invisible seam. There is also whip stitch, which is probably more commonly used. So I've got an alternate part 2 video that'll show you how to use the whip stitch. In my opinion, with whip stitch, it's a lot harder to get an invisible seam, but the whip stitch does tend to be a little bit sturdier and maybe a little bit tighter of a seam. So it's kind of your choice. It's a toss-up. And you have to choose the right stitch for your project. So you can watch both part 2 videos and then decide which one will be the right stitch for you and for your project.